Naaman desperately needs healing, and he needs it now. He's a high-ranking general in the Aramean army, which is another word for Syria. But diseases don't play favorites, and having status isn't a vaccine. Naaman has leprosy. As Dr. Andrzej Grabowski explains, leprosy isn't the sort of disease that we deal with now where you lose feeling in your nerves. It was rather a skin disease, a skin condition, described by Dr. Grabowski as a swelling of the skin with a white crustish patch on the outside. And we can assume that Naaman had this pretty much everywhere on his body, not just on one localized part on his hand. He desperately needs healing. If you've ever been afflicted with some sort of skin condition like eczema, you know exactly what it's like. The kind of feeling where if you scratch, you're going to make it worse, but you need to scratch because it hurts. And he knows that it's not just about his physical scratching, but also the embarrassment. He's a high-ranking general, and he's looking like a leopard. So he needs to get healing, and he's willing to do whatever it takes. A servant girl that he had captured during some war against Israel tells him, "If you're willing to do anything, maybe you should go to Israel because there's a healer in Israel. I think he's got you covered." And at this point, Naaman's willing to do anything. Heck, he's willing to try essential oils if it'll help him because he wants to get healed. So he takes her advice and he goes to the king of Aram and says, "Hey, I need to get this healed and I heard that there's somebody in Israel who can help me." The king of Aram loves Naaman, so he gives him 10 sets of clothing, a big commodity in that time period, maybe fine linen sets of clothing, and 2 talents of silver for Naaman to take as his gift to this healer. Naaman takes this to the king of Israel, who redirects him to the house of Elisha the healer. And he thinks he's in for something special because Elisha is this healer. As he walks into this foreign land, into Elisha's territory, to Elisha's house, anticipation is building. What sort of healing will he get? Is Elisha going to call down something from heaven? Is he going to touch Naaman and Naaman will be healed? Will Naaman be healed as soon as he steps foot on Elisha's doorstep? Well, he gets to the house and Elisha's not home. He rings the proverbial doorbell and he gets a message. Elisha just says to him through a messenger, "Go dip yourself in the Jordan River." The Jordan River? That's insane. He wanted to get something miraculous, not have to dip himself in this average stream. Aren't there better rivers in Damascus, he says? Well, his servants persuade him, "You might as well do it. You're already here. You're in a foreign land." And Naaman, though he's hot, sweaty, itchy, might as well give it a shot. So he dips himself 7 times in the Jordan River. And on the 7th time, he stands up and everything's different. Not just his skin is different, but his heart has changed. And that's where we get to our passage today. I'd invite you to turn in your text to 2 Kings chapter 5, since you already have it open. We're going to be starting at verse 15. Then Naaman and his whole company went back to the man of God, stood before him and declared, "I know there's no God in the whole world except in Israel. Therefore, please accept a gift from your servant." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, in whose presence I stand, I will not accept it." Naaman urged him to accept it, but he refused. Naaman responded, "If not, please let your servant be given as much soil as a pair of mules can carry. For your servants will no longer offer a burnt offering or sacrifice to any other god but the Lord. However, in a particular matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master, the king of Aram, goes into the temple of Rimmon to bow and worship while he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow in the temple of Rimmon. When I bow in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord pardon your servant in this matter." So he said to him, "Go in peace." After Naaman had traveled a short distance from Elisha, Gehazi, the attendant of Elisha, the man of God, thought, "My master has let this Aramean Naaman off lightly by not accepting from him what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him." So Gehazi pursued Naaman. When Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from his chariot to meet him and asked, "Is everything all right?" Gehazi answered, "It's all right. My master has sent me to say, I have just discovered that 2 young men from the sons of the prophets have come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them 75 pounds of silver and 2 sets of clothing." But Naaman insisted, "Please accept 150 pounds. He urged Gehazi and then packed 150 pounds of silver in 2 bags with 2 sets of clothing. Naaman gave them to 2 of his attendants, who carried them ahead of Gehazi. When Gehazi came to the hill, he took the gifts from them and deposited them in the house. Then he dismissed the men, and they left. Gehazi came and stood by his master. "Where did you go, Gehazi?" Elisha asked him. He replied, "Your servant didn't go anywhere." "And my heart didn't go with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you," Elisha said. "Is this a time to accept silver and clothing, olive orchards and vineyards, flocks and herds and male and female slaves? Therefore, Naaman's skin disease will cling to you and your descendants forever." So Gehazi went out from his presence, diseased, resembling snow. The word of the Lord. Naaman, a proud outsider, becomes an insider. The leper becomes clean. And in this passage, we see the opposite happen for Gehazi. Gehazi, a proud insider, becomes an outsider, and the clean man becomes a leper. Naaman prostrates himself at Elisha's feet with everyone watching. He stands in front of Elisha. Gehazi, after taking that money, that clothing from Naaman, stands beside Elisha, thinking that he's Elisha's equal. Elisha swears by the Lord's name, "I will not accept the gift as the Lord lives." Gehazi swears by the Lord, "I will take from this Aramean what my master let off too lightly." You can tell that Gehazi is a foil for this man, Naaman. Naaman's supposed to be the person who understands who the God of Israel is. Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, doesn't understand who God is. But is Gehazi really in the wrong? Because it's easy for us to say Gehazi messed up, but come on, we can surely understand a little bit of it. We've had experiences where we wish that we had taken advantage more of a situation than we did. When I was in college, my dad forwarded me a slick deal for $5 dress shirts from not a thrift store, but from J. Crew. And so I purchased a white dress shirt for $5 from J. Crew. A few years later, a stain got on it and I had to discard it. And I think to myself so often now, if only I had just bought 2 dress shirts. Whoever gets the opportunity to buy J. Crew dress shirts for $5? Is Gehazi really in the wrong? Because maybe he just wanted to take advantage of what was happening in that situation. It's true that Gehazi turns his back on his master's original intent, but we have to think about the other situations, the other circumstances. After all, think about it this way. When he chased after Naaman, he wasn't actually getting Naaman's money. Because whose money really was this? The king of Aram. He wasn't taking from Naaman, he was taking from the Arameans, who are Israel's enemies. It's like if you go out to lunch with a friend and your friend says, "Oh, my dad's got it," and he holds up that dad's credit card. You don't feel like you're taking advantage of your friend. It's just his dad's credit card. And it's not just that it's not Naaman's money. Also, he was entitled to that. Elisha and Gehazi, they're entitled to the profits of being a prophet. In fact, Elisha has accepted before gifts and will accept in the future gifts. In 2 Kings chapter 8, just 3 chapters after this, Elisha ends up accepting a gift from someone else who approaches him. So it's not like prophets are required to say no to gifts. Why can't Gehazi just take what was rightfully his? Doesn't the laborer deserve his wages? Shouldn't we not muzzle an ox when it treads out on the grain? In addition, Naaman doesn't seem to mind at all. Right when Naaman sees Gehazi running from a distance, NRSV says he jumped down from his chariot, excited to talk to him. And when Gehazi asks him for 75 pounds of silver, Naaman says, "I'll give you 150. So it doesn't seem like he's taking advantage of Naaman in any way. Is Gehazi really in the wrong? Well, the passage seems to think so. At least Elisha seems to think so. Elisha knows what has happened. God has divinely revealed it to him, that Gehazi has acted out of greed. And he confronts Gehazi, gives him the opportunity to tell the truth, and Gehazi lies to him. But come on, Elisha, shouldn't you be a little bit more patient? Why are you so upset? You didn't even tell Gehazi why you had rejected Naaman's gifts before. When Naaman offered you the gifts, Elisha had just said, as the Lord lives, I'm not going to accept it, with no explanation. But that's precisely the point. Elisha doesn't have to defend his calling. It just was clear that it was his calling. He felt that the Lord did not want Elisha to accept the gifts. As the Lord lives, he swore, I will not accept the gifts. So Gehazi's mistake was turning his back on their calling as prophets, turning his back on what the Lord had called Elisha to do. And real ministers don't turn their back on their calling. Because there's always a way to justify greed. There's always a way to start thinking about money, to start thinking about what you're owed as a minister, to start thinking about whether you deserve a pay raise. I mean, $10 an hour for grad assistants? Come on. Don't we deserve a pay raise? It's easy for us to harbor resentment that our check, when we see it, is such a small amount. What am I doing ministry for this small amount? And it's not to say that we can't ever think about money, but if it ever turns us away from our calling, causes us to turn our back on what God has called us to do, that's when it becomes sinful. But it's not just money. We can also be tempted to start looking for praise, for glory, for recognition in our congregation. I know it's a constant struggle for me at my church. When I first started speaking, a lot of people would come up after me and say, Pastor, that was a great sermon. And as I've now been there for about a year and a half, people say that a lot less to me. And sometimes I start to think about it. It would be really nice if somebody would just come up and tell me I had a great message. But I have to remind myself, why am I here? Am I here for praise and glory and recognition? Or am I here because God called me to this? And in seeking that praise, maybe I'm turning my back on my original calling. So how do we keep ourselves motivated if the pay is really low or if nobody's giving us compliments? I think we have to take heed of Elisha's words to his servant Gehazi. Because Elisha tells him, if you start to care about the little things, the temptations are going to start ratcheting up. Notice what he says to Gehazi. He starts by saying, is it time to accept silver and clothing, those great commodities? Or is it a time to accept vineyards and orchards, or flocks and herds, or male and female servants? It's ratcheting up from just accepting money to accepting slaves. And the same temptation can be true for us. We start by just wanting some praise. We keep going, wanting a little bit more money. We want a larger and larger congregation, and we get to the point where we're so far from our calling, we can't even recognize what our calling originally was. The temptations are always temptations that keep ratcheting up, and eventually we may abandon our calling. We may turn our back on our calling. I know this from experience. When I was in high school, a little bit before high school, I used to be obsessed with purchasing Nerf guns. Sometimes these Nerf guns that I would buy would be defective. They would jam. They wouldn't work properly, and so I would return them. When I first started returning these Nerf guns, I would keep the bullets, the foam bullets, because they were used. They were not in pristine condition. Nobody was going to use those bullets if I returned that gun. Eventually, I started thinking, well, if I return the gun, they're probably going to throw it out anyway, so might as well keep the magazines too. Nobody wants magazines that have been touched by some other kid. But where does it stop? Because that's where I stopped. But what if I kept going? What if I said, they might as well give me the gun too, because they're going to throw it out if it's defective. I might as well keep that for parts. Temptations are always ratcheting up. And now that's a silly story, but that temptation happens in real life. A famous example is the character of Judas. In John, the Gospel of John explains that Judas used to take money from the money bag. He was a thief. That's a small thing until it became 30 pieces of silver. Until it became betraying Jesus Christ. Because if we keep looking for little praise, little more money, little bit bigger congregation, the temptations just keep ratcheting up, and eventually we will turn our back on our calling. A practical way of thinking about this is just to remove yourselves from the center of your ministry, because that's what Elisha does. He's the main character of this story, believe it or not. Elisha is the main character of the beginning of 2 Kings as a whole. But how often does Elisha speak? Elisha says very little in this passage at all. He doesn't even show up when Naaman comes to his door. When Naaman comes later, he says one sentence, "As the Lord lives, I will not accept anything." And when Gehazi comes back, he reprimands him with one rhetorical question and then a statement about his condition. And that's it. Because for Elisha, he doesn't need to speak that much. He wants God to take center stage, not himself. And we can take that page out of Elisha's playbook. Instead of thinking about ourselves when we preach what's the praise that we can get, if we as ministers will remember that God is the center of our stories, then we won't have to turn our back on our calling. We won't be worried about these temptations that are ratcheting up. Because when we begin to think about our money, our time, what we deserve, what we can gain, what praise we can get, that's when we begin to turn our back on God's calling. And if you've felt called to ministry, then you've been called to ministry, not called to money. You've been called to service, not called to surplus. You've been called to give. You have been called to gain. Don't lose sight of why you chose to continue in ministry. Don't lose sight of why we all came here to seminary. Don't turn your back on God's calling.